The real question isn't simply how demanding the role was, it's how much of a soul it required. This was never just a story about two people sharing the screen. It was a quiet collision of unspoken histories, pride, and emotions buried so deep they shaped entire careers. Creating something authentic under those circumstances becomes less about memorizing lines and more about navigating silence. What happens when one presence hesitates, when collaboration feels like walking across fragile glass? What compels a man to spend decades carefully steering around a single name, especially one as iconic as Robert Redford, as though even mentioning it might reopen an invisible chapter? And then, at 88, when time has softened defenses and perspective has reshaped memory, he finally chose to speak. The statement was not loud, not dramatic, yet it carried the weight of years, sending a ripple through Hollywood that no spotlight could ignore. At the memorial for his late friend Dustin Hoffman, the air felt unusually still as he walked slowly toward the stage. The room quieted on its own, as if sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Every gaze followed him. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled but carried unmistakable clarity. "I envy him." It was a simple confession, yet it resonated far beyond the walls of the venue. Those three words did not signal collapse, but revelation, a glimpse into a bond shaped by admiration, comparison, and years of unspoken reflection. In a single breath, he transformed a farewell into a moment of rare honesty, reminding everyone that even the brightest careers are woven with complex emotions. Today's story takes us beyond public images and into the quiet currents beneath them, where respect and rivalry can coexist, and where truth sometimes waits decades to be voiced. Join us as we uncover this layered narrative, filled with depth and humanity. If this story inspires you, leave a 1-inch the comments. If you see it differently, share a 0 and tell us why. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. Your perspective keeps the conversation alive. The press often described him as one of Hollywood's last enduring gentlemen, a figure associated with steadiness and principle. At the same time, Hoffman was hailed as a defining talent of his era, admired for his fearless dedication to craft. He gravitated toward roles layered with vulnerability and contradiction. From Kramer versus Kramer to Rain Man, he portrayed characters marked by imperfection, sensitivity, and emotional depth. His relentless pursuit of authenticity, however, sometimes shaped a complicated reputation. Stories circulated about his intensity on set, a perfectionism that could be misunderstood as rigidity. Some collaborators suggested that he didn't merely perform a character. He immersed himself so fully that the boundaries blurred. Two men, two trajectories. One frequently celebrated as a composed icon, the other recognized as a demanding artist unwilling to settle for surface simplicity. Their paths reflected not opposition, but different, distinct philosophies navigating the same demanding world of cinema. As Redford continued to receive honors beneath bright lights, Hoffman seemed to retreat further into introspection, choosing depth over display. Yet the greatest separation between them was not measured in awards or miles. It lived in subtleties, in pauses, in timing, in the space between two sets of eyes that once met with effortless understanding. At public ceremonies, they remained courteous, offering composed smiles when cameras turned their way. But something intangible had shifted. During one awards night in the early 1980s, a fleeting moment was captured. As Redford moved past, Hoffman inclined his head slightly, his gaze drifting just a fraction to the side. It was brief, almost imperceptible, yet attentive viewers sensed a quiet change. Nothing dramatic occurred, no words, no visible conflict. And perhaps that was what made it powerful. Sometimes distance reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in the absence of the smallest ones. Friends from that era would later share that in the 1990s, whenever Redford's name surfaced in conversation, Hoffman often grew still. The silence that followed was not sharp or resentful, it felt reflective, almost tender. There was no visible frustration, only the quiet weight of memory. The person who once understood him without explanation had become a distant reference, a name that carried more history than words could comfortably hold. Redford, when asked about Hoffman, responded with measured composure. He spoke of respect and of the meaningful work they had once created together. His tone was steady, neither sentimental nor dismissive, simply acknowledging a chapter that had shaped them both. It sounded less like avoidance and more like acceptance. By the early 2000s, their public paths rarely intersected. Redford devoted himself to Sundance and to mentoring emerging voices, while Hoffman appeared selectively, choosing projects with care. The world still linked their names in retrospectives, yet in daily life, their journeys unfolded separately, two legacies moving forward on parallel tracks, connected by history but no longer shared in real time. It seemed as though both had quietly chosen restraint, as if silence itself were a fragile shield protecting what remained of their shared history. Time moved on, carrying them along separate currents, until one evening they found themselves in the same room again at an art fundraising event in Beverly Hills. Amid the low hum of conversation and soft applause, Hoffman paused, watching as Redford stepped onto the stage. His hair had turned silver, yet the composed smile remained familiar, steady, almost timeless. When Redford turned, their eyes met for a brief second. No words followed, just a subtle nod, small but meaningful, like an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had once been. They remained courteous, measured, and distant, not strangers, yet no longer intertwined. Two men shaped by different seasons of the same story, standing under the same lights, connected by memory more than by presence. After that evening, Hoffman returned home later than usual. A close friend once shared that he sat quietly in front of the television, replaying an old interview from 1976, a moment when he and Redford laughed freely while speaking about their work together. The screen glowed with a version of themselves that felt both familiar and distant. When asked gently, "Would you ever want to see him again?" Hoffman paused before answering. His response was simple. He wasn't sure he would know what to say. It wasn't reluctance, it was the uncertainty that comes when time reshapes what once felt effortless. The two men who had once understood each other without explanation now seemed to communicate only through archived footage and printed words. For nearly 20 years, silence stood between them, not dramatic, not loud, but enduring. It was the kind of quiet that carries both dignity and ache, like a healed mark that leaves no visible trace, yet still remembers where it once was. And then, when news came that Robert Redford had passed away, the long silence between them finally gave way to something deeply human. In September 2025, reports spread across Hollywood that Redford had died peacefully in his sleep at his home in Sundance. The announcement arrived quietly, yet it carried immense weight. That same day, Hoffman was in Los Angeles, working on a small, independent project. Between takes, his assistant approached and delivered the news in a low voice. Hoffman acknowledged it with a slight nod, saying nothing at first. Moments later, his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for those nearby to sense the impact. He turned aside, composing himself away from the set's bright lights. A crew member later recalled that he remained still for several long minutes, as if absorbing not just the headline, but the decades attached to it. Eventually, he placed the camera down with care and stepped outside, seeking a quiet breath. There was no spectacle, no public display, only the stillness that follows when memory and reality meet all at once. No one on set spoke. The atmosphere carried a quiet awareness that some news does not require commentary. That evening, Hoffman returned home and switched on his old television, searching for a familiar recording from 1976, a time when he and Redford sat side by side, laughing easily as they discussed Watergate and the craft they both respected. The images flickered with warmth, almost untouched by time. Sometime past midnight, he opened a worn notebook and wrote a few brief lines. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years, a thought lingering that perhaps there had been more left unsaid. 3 weeks later, he traveled to Sundance to attend the memorial. The late afternoon light in Utah cast a gentle glow through the wooden windows of the modest hall. A cool breeze moved softly through the space, as if nature itself had chosen a quieter tone for the occasion. It was there, in that stillness, that he prepared to voice what had remained unspoken for decades, not with drama, but with sincerity shaped by time. A soft amber glow settled over the aisle, illuminating rows of black and white photographs that traced Robert Redford's journey, the youthful figure on set. The quiet smile captured between takes, the silhouette standing against open hills. Each image felt less like a portrait and more like a memory carefully preserved. In the front row sat longtime colleagues alongside younger filmmakers whose paths he had once encouraged. The press had agreed to keep their presence discreet, yet the quiet movement of lenses remained, observing without intrusion. Then Dustin Hoffman stepped forward. His hair, now white, caught the light as he approached the podium in a simple black suit. His shoulders carried the gentle curve of time. One hand rested steadily on the wood, the other held a folded sheet of paper marked by creases, as if revised more than once. The room grew still, not out of spectacle, but anticipation. It was the stillness reserved for moments when history and emotion share the same breath. He paused, drawing in a slow breath, then lifted his gaze toward the large portrait centered above the hall. The host's gentle question lingered in the air. If you could share one final message, what would it be? The room seemed to exhale all at once, settling into a silence so complete it felt almost tangible. Hoffman lowered his head. 10 seconds passed. 20, 30. The faint sound of paper shifting in his hand echoed softly. In the second row, someone clasped the armrest a little tighter. A technician, perhaps unintentionally, dimmed the lights by a subtle degree, and the atmosphere grew even more hushed. Cameras in the back were raised, then lowered again, as if even the smallest click might disturb what was unfolding. Finally, Hoffman lifted his head. His voice emerged low and textured by emotion, yet steady. "I'm sorry." "I was jealous of him," he continued, the words steady but unadorned, "and I let that feeling build walls where there should have been doors." The hall remained still, no whispers, only the quiet rhythm of breath shared among those present. He paused again, adjusting his glasses, gathering composure before speaking further. "There was a time when he reached out to me during a difficult chapter in this business. He told me he believed in my work, even when I doubted it myself. I never said those words back to him." In the fourth row, someone discreetly passed a tissue along. Near the back, a camera was lowered, its operator choosing presence over documentation. Hoffman unfolded the paper in his hand, glancing at it briefly, then set it aside. After a screening of ordinary people, he called. I missed the call. A few days later, he sent a short note. He paused, the memory lingering between sentences. It wasn't long, just a few lines of congratulations. The room understood that sometimes what matters most is not what is written, but what remains unspoken. "Wish you were here." I never replied. The sentence settled gently into the wooden floorboards, like small stones dropped into still water. A reporter who had been writing paused mid-note, lifting her eyes as if to make sure she had heard correctly. In the far corner, someone from Redford's team shifted position, subtly blocking a beam of light that had fallen too harshly across the podium, a quiet gesture that seemed to soften the entire room. Hoffman drew a slow breath, not to steady himself, but to let something long carried finally loosen. He spoke with care, weighing each word before releasing it. For years, I thought what I felt was simply admiration. Today, I see it differently. Perhaps I valued him more deeply than I allowed myself to say. He paused, then clarified gently. It wasn't about romance. It was about respect, about connection, about two people who once understood each other without explanation. The room remained silent, not out of shock, but recognition, because sometimes the most powerful realizations arrive not in youth, but in reflection. It was the kind of bond, he continued softly, that draws you close, yet makes you afraid of being fully understood. In the family section, a subtle nod acknowledged the truth in those words. In the press area, a few camera shutters clicked instinctively, then fell quiet. Even the photographers sensed that some moments are meant to be witnessed, not archived. Hoffman closed his eyes briefly, as though revisiting a distant room filled with brighter days. When he opened them, his gaze rested on Redford's smiling portrait. "I spent years trying to prove how different I was," he admitted. "Different in style, in choices, in voice, but in the end, what I really wanted was simple to sit beside him again. Not as legends, not as headlines, just as two men who once laughed so hard in a makeup room in 1976 that we forgot the world outside." The room remained still, holding the weight of a realization that had taken decades to surface. A quiet sigh drifted from somewhere in the back row, belonging to no one and everyone at once. The host held the microphone but found no words to add. Backstage, a technician remained motionless, fingers resting on a control lever, allowing the silence to linger undisturbed. Hoffman folded the sheet of paper with deliberate care, as though closing a chapter that had waited years to be completed. His voice, rough but steady, carried one final reflection. "I understood too late," he said softly, "that sometimes what we call jealousy is only another name for feelings we never learned how to express." He did not lower his head. Instead, he rested his palm gently on the podium, tapped it twice, a simple, personal gesture of goodbye, and stepped away. The audience rose almost as one, not in applause, but in shared respect. The silence that followed felt fuller than any ovation could have been. Not from uncertainty, but from understanding, because some truths, once spoken aloud, deserve to be carried quietly rather than applauded. As Hoffman stepped down the final stair, the press team hesitated. A young reporter lifted his pen, ready with a question, then slowly closed his notebook and murmured, "Later." Across the room, a message was sent to an editor. "Keep the headline measured." This moment called for reflection, not spectacle. In the lobby, television cameras stood prepared, yet the lead producer gestured subtly, capture only his departure, nothing more. It was a collective decision to protect the gravity of what had just been shared. The memorial resumed with a brief violin piece. Its melody rose gently toward the wooden rafters, then softened, drifting into the evening air like a quiet farewell. When the doors finally opened, Hoffman walked through a corridor lined with photographs, frozen fragments of a life once shared in frames of light and shadow. He paused before a photograph of Redford standing in a snow-covered forest, a faint smile resting on his face, the kind reserved for moments unposed and unannounced. No camera turned toward Hoffman then. The only person nearby quietly stepped aside, granting him a brief, private stillness after years defined by distance. In that silent exchange between memory and presence, it became clear he was not asking for absolution. He was simply placing a friendship back where it belonged, beyond rumor, beyond glare, beyond the distortion of headlines. It was less a confession than a restoration. As he stepped out of the hall, a cool breeze slipped from the eaves and brushed against his back. The violin's final notes dissolved into the evening, and even the surrounding murmurs softened, as though the air itself understood that something delicate had just been set gently back into place. In newsrooms from Wall Street to Sunset Boulevard, editors began to write, yet their keystrokes felt measured, almost restrained. The tone shifted. There was no appetite for spectacle, no urge to dissect or dramatize. For once, interpretation stepped aside, allowing the moment to stand on its own. The story now belonged to a man who had spent a lifetime under bright lights, yet chose to speak without ornament or defense. His words were not crafted for impact. They carried the quiet weight of reflection. There was calm in his voice, but also a trace of sorrow that no achievement could erase. And gradually, those listening understood something deeper. The truth he had carried for decades was never about blame. It was not a confession of wrongdoing. It was the simple, courageous admission of vulnerability, the acknowledgement that even the strongest figures can be shaped by emotions they once struggled to name. There were moments of quiet weakness he carried alone, unseen crossroads that shaped difficult choices and restless nights. They were never displayed on stage or preserved in photographs, yet they influenced more than any headline ever could. When the layers of fame, pride, and prolonged silence finally settled, What remained was something far more human, the fragile honesty we often hesitate to reveal. The story was no longer about assigning blame or declaring who stood on higher ground. It became a reflection on what endured once the applause faded. Beyond rivalry and recognition, beyond triumphs and turning points, there were the subtle imprints they left on one another, lessons of understanding, resilience, and quiet respect. Whatever distance time created, the bond that shaped them both did not vanish. It transformed. In the end, it was not spectacle that defined their legacy together, but the enduring trace of empathy that survived every storm the industry placed in their path. Robert Redford rested at Sundance, the place he had shaped with conviction and care, a landscape where art was not merely produced, but protected. Snow settled quietly over wooden rooftops, softening every edge. Inside the hall, memorial lights still cast a warm glow over his familiar smile, like the final trace of daylight lingering beyond the horizon. It felt less like an ending, and more like a continuation, a legacy rooted in belief that storytelling could elevate, heal, and connect. Hundreds of miles away in Los Angeles, Dustin Hoffman sat alone in his modest living room. An old piano rested against the wall. A half-finished script remained open on the table, waiting. Through the window, dusk lowered itself over rows of red-tiled roofs, dimming the city into quiet tones. He watched the fading light and spoke softly, almost to himself. He was the one who reminded me that friendship here could still be real. The words were not dramatic, only sincere, a final acknowledgement that beyond careers and applause, what endures are the rare connections that shape who we become. His voice carried a roughness, rising from somewhere deep within, each word weighted with feeling too layered to fully articulate. On the table beside him rested an old notebook, its pages softened by time. The final page remained unfinished, a sentence trailing into open space. "If I could turn back time, I would pick up the phone." The line was simple, almost ordinary, yet it held more than paragraphs ever could. Regret, affection, humility, and understanding were folded into those few words. Some emotions resist explanation. They exist not to be analyzed, but to be acknowledged. Though their shared chapter had closed years earlier, its resonance continued. What they left behind was more than celebrated performances or red carpet moments. It was a quiet lesson about comparison and compassion, about how admiration can be misunderstood, and how forgiveness often begins within oneself. Their story became less about distance, and more about what survives it, a connection shaped by time, tested by silence, and remembered not for its fractures, but for its depth. Those values linger still in recollections, in thoughtful glances, in the silent recognition of anyone who has ever allowed pride to stand where gratitude wished to speak. Two men, one still walking beneath the present sky, the other carried now by memory, continue to stand side by side in that delicate space between spotlight and shadow. Though time has drawn a line between them, the bond they shaped was never fully erased. It lingers in stories not loudly told, in glimmers of archived light, and in the quiet corners of Hollywood's history, where legacy settles like dust on film reels. Their presence endures in photographs that refuse to fade, in scenes from a golden era that feels distant yet strangely near. They are no longer framed together by premieres or headlines, yet the imprint of what they shared remains subtle, persistent, almost timeless. And perhaps, in a world crowded with noise and spectacle, their story reminds us that some friendships do not require constant display to survive. Even without tabloid mentions or stage lights, something continues carried in memory, in reflection, in the hearts of those who once witnessed that rare connection, not vanished, simply transformed into something quieter, but enduring. What are your thoughts on this enduring bond? Do you believe their connection meant more than the glamour and spotlight that surrounded them? Leave a 1-inch in the comments if this story moved or inspired you, or a 0 if you see it from a different perspective. We'd love to hear your view. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next compelling story. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.